My name is Renata Holloway. I am 38 years old. I am standing in my own kitchen at 2:14 in the morning, staring at a text message on my phone that someone sent from a number I don't recognize. A burner. The kind of number that exists for one reason only: to deliver a truth that no real person has the courage to put their name on. I read it once, and then I read it again, and then I set my phone face down on the counter because I needed a single second where the words weren't real yet, where I could still be the woman I was 3 minutes ago, the woman who was just getting a glass of water before going back to bed, the woman whose biggest problem that night was that her youngest had kicked off her blanket twice, and the furnace was making that sound again, the one I kept meaning to call someone about, and the kitchen smelled like the garlic bread we'd had for dinner. My kids' drawings were still stuck to the refrigerator with alphabet magnets. A crayon, red, sat on the edge of the counter where my daughter had left it at homework time. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be, and none of it was real anymore, because what that text told me, in plain, ugly, unadorned sentences, was that for the last 2 years, the woman who sat at my dinner table every single week, the woman who held my hand in the hospital after my second delivery, the woman who braided my daughter's hair and called me her little sister, the woman who had a husband and 5 children of her own and had been sewn into the fabric of my family for 19 years. That woman had been sleeping with my husband in my house while I slept across the hall, and I want you to sit with that for just 1 second. Not the betrayal of the husband. That came later. That had its own shape, its own weight. What I need you to understand first is the other one, the woman, because she was not a stranger who wandered into my life. She was the architecture of it. She was in every photo. She was in every holiday. She was at the table the night we announced we were trying for our last baby. She was the one who asked, with her voice warm and her eyes soft. She asked me about the details of my marriage that a woman only shares when she trusts someone completely, and she took every single thing I told her, and she ran back to him with it. I stood there in my kitchen for I don't know how long enough for the refrigerator to hum and stop and hum again, long enough for the streetlight outside to flicker once, and I kept thinking, there is a version of this that makes sense. There is an explanation I haven't thought of yet. There is something I'm missing. I picked my phone back up. I read the message a 3rd time. There was nothing I was missing. And the thing that shattered me, not broke me, shattered me, the kind of breaking that doesn't leave clean edges, wasn't even what they did. It was how long, how casually, how completely, and what it meant about everything I thought I knew. Before I tell you the rest, I need you to understand who I was before that text, because who I became after will only make sense if you understand what was destroyed first. Let me take you back to a Sunday afternoon in October. I want to say it was 2019, 2 years before the wedding, and there were 11 people in my backyard. My cousin Marcus was at the grill, and his wife, Deja, was at the patio table with her youngest in her lap, braiding my daughter Imani's hair with rubber bands she kept pulling from her wrist. My kids were running in the grass. Someone had put on music through the portable speaker, something old, and R&B and warm, and the light was doing that October thing where it comes in low and gold and makes everything look like a painting of itself. I remember looking around and thinking, this is it. This is exactly it. I had known Marcus my whole life. We grew up 2 streets apart. He was the cousin who taught me to ride a bike, who sat with me at my father's funeral when I was 16 and didn't say a word, just stayed. He married Deja when I was in my early 20s. I was in the wedding. I gave a toast. I cried through it. Deja came into my life the way only a few people ever do, sideways and fast and permanent, before you've even decided. She was funny in a way that was specific and real, not performed. She remembered details. If you mentioned something in passing in March, she'd ask about it in August, and you'd think, you actually listened to me. She and I fell into the rhythm of people who were supposed to find each other. She started calling me her little sister within the first year. I called her the same. Marcus and Deja had 5 children across 8 years. Their house was loud and layered and full. My kids adored all 5 of them. My daughter Imani had a bond with their second daughter Kira. That was the kind of friendship that forms between children when they have no idea they're creating a memory. Same kindergarten teacher. Same playground. Every single week, those 2 little girls held hands. And my husband, I'll call him by the name he told me to use in public, Derek. Derek fit into all of it seamlessly. He and Marcus had their own thing. The thing 2 men build when they're adjacent to the same family long enough. Fantasy football, barbecue debates, the easy shorthand of men who have stood next to each other at enough backyard gatherings. Derek came into my life when my first son, Caleb, was 4 years old. Caleb's father had died. A sudden thing. The kind that still doesn't feel like it has a real explanation when I try to tell it. And Caleb was this small person who didn't entirely understand why his dad stopped being there. Derek met Caleb before he met me, essentially. Or it felt that way. Because from the first time they were in the same room, and Derek made a point of it, of being present, of being deliberate. He got down on one knee and talked to my 4-year-old like he was worth being talked to. And I watched that happen, and I thought, there it is. That was my undoing, not his charm with me, his kindness with my son. I want to be honest about that, because it matters for everything that comes later. The most effective lie isn't the lie someone tells you about themselves. It's the truth they show you in the beginning. The truth that makes you dismiss everything that comes after. The kindness was real. I believe that. I have to believe that. But it was also the door, and I walked through it without checking what was on the other side. We were together for years before we married. Good years, mostly. Normal years. And the kind with arguments and repairs, and the slow accumulation of inside jokes and shared logistics, and the specific comfort of sleeping next to someone you've chosen. He was present with Caleb in a way I didn't take for granted. When we had Imani together, and then our youngest, Maya, Derek became the father of my household in every practical sense. And Deja was there for all of it. For every pregnancy, for every hard conversation, for the times Derek and I fought, and I'd call her from the car, and she'd say the right things. She'd say, "He loves you. You know he does. You're going to be okay." She said those things to me while she was sleeping with him. But I didn't know that yet. On that October Sunday, and I didn't know anything except that I was a woman in her mid-30s with 3 children, and a man who had chosen her, and a family around her that felt like walls in the best possible way. Solid, holding, permanent. I didn't know yet that walls can also be a cage. I didn't know yet that some of those people weren't standing beside me. They were watching me from the other side of something I couldn't see. The first time something felt wrong, I explained it away in under 30 seconds. It was a Thursday evening, maybe 8 months before the wedding. Derek had come home late, later than he said he would, and when I asked where he'd been, his answer was slightly too even. Not defensive, not irritated, just smooth, practiced. Like a sentence that had been rehearsed enough times to lose its original shape. As I looked at him for a beat longer than I should have. He looked back at me and asked if I'd eaten. I said no. He made eggs, and we sat at the kitchen counter and ate, and I told myself that the feeling I'd had, that specific cold feeling in the center of your chest when something doesn't line up, I told myself that was anxiety. That was my history. That was what it felt like to love someone when you've already lost someone, and the fear of loss lives in your body like a second skeleton. He was making eggs. He was right here. He was fine. This is the thing about the slow burn of being deceived by someone skilled at it. They don't make large errors. They make tiny, marginal ones that sit just inside the border of what can be explained. And you, because you are a reasonable person, because you love them, yet because you have children who are watching you choose between peace and paranoia, you reach for the explanation every single time, because the explanation is easier, because the alternative is a door you are not ready to open. He started creating chaos around arguments. That's the only way I know how to say it. When I would try to have a real conversation, especially when I was trying to establish a boundary or name something that was bothering me, he would escalate in a direction that had nothing to do with the original subject. He would bring up something old, something I thought was resolved, and suddenly I was defending a version of myself from 3 years ago, instead of talking about what I'd actually raised. And by the end of the conversation, I would be exhausted and disoriented and faintly apologetic, and whatever I'd originally wanted to address had dissolved. I mentioned this to Deja once. I said, "Do you ever feel like when you try to talk to Marcus about something, the conversation becomes about something else entirely?" And she said yes. Men do that. She said it's a deflection thing. She said the key is to stay grounded in your original point, to not get pulled into the vortex. She coached me. She coached my communication with him. And then she turned around and reported everything back to him. I understand now that every conversation I had with her about Derek was a briefing. She knew what I was going to say before I said it. She knew what I was worried about before I raised it. She knew where my boundaries were, so that he could find the precise line to walk that kept me just uncertain enough, just guilty enough, and just off balance enough to stay. There was an argument, one of many, but this one was different, where Derek came into the bedroom after we'd fought, after I'd tried to say something real, and he'd turned it into noise, and I was already asleep, or most of the way asleep, the kind of sleep that's thin, right at the surface, where you're still tethered to the room around you. And something happened. I woke up in pain. A sharp, specific pain on my upper arm and my back. I was confused the way you're confused in the first seconds of waking from something bad. I thought, nightmare. I thought, I was dreaming, and my body responded. Derek was beside me. Nothing was wrong. He told me in the morning, "You had a night terror." He said I was moving around. He tried to wake me. I wouldn't come out of it. I believed him. The ER visit came 2 days later because the pain hadn't gone away. And when the doctor looked at my arm, she asked me twice how I'd gotten the injury. I told her what Derek told me. Night terror. She wrote it down. She looked at me with an expression I did not have language for at the time, but I understand now perfectly. She was deciding whether to push. She didn't, and I walked out with stitches in my arm, and a story that didn't come from me, and a husband who held my hand in the waiting room and talked to the nurses with the easy warmth of a man who had nothing to hide. 2 months after our wedding, Deja showed up with the same injury, the exact same place, the exact same shape. And in the group chat she ran, the one with all the spouses, all the family, in the one full of memes and birthday reminders and dinner logistics. They made a joke about it, him and her, about the mirroring, about how funny it was that they'd both had the same kind of accident. I read that joke and felt something cold move through me that I didn't name for a long time. I should have named it then. It had a name. The night I got the burner text, I didn't wake Derek. I want you to understand that choice, because in the versions of this moment I'd imagined, and I had imagined versions in the back of my mind, in the dark corners where the cold feeling lived. In all of them, I was loud. I was righteous. I walked into that bedroom, and I said the thing, and I watched his face, and I got some version of the truth in real time. But when the moment actually came, I just stood in my kitchen, and I stood there until my feet got cold from the tile, and the refrigerator hummed, and the crayon on the counter stayed red, and the rest of the house stayed sleeping. And then I did what I actually do when something is too large to process standing up. I made a list. Not a list out loud. A list in my head. Facts. Just facts. No feeling, not yet. The text said, Deja and Derek have been involved for years. It started before your wedding. It happened in your home. People around you know. I thought, who sent this and why? I thought, what do I actually have in my hands that confirms or denies this? I thought about the joke in the group chat. I thought about my arm. I thought about the argument that preceded the thing that Derek called a night terror. I thought about the pregnancy he told me about 6 months after our wedding, in the one that he said was a scare from before we were serious. The one that resulted in an abortion. The one I had processed alone in a bathroom, while my baby was asleep in the next room. And I told myself that it was old, it was over, we were fine. Deja had been asking me about trying for our last baby at the same time that abortion was happening. She had asked me with her face open and her voice warm. She had asked me details about our intimacy. She had held my hand and said she was so excited for us. I sat down on the kitchen floor. Just sat down, because standing wasn't something my body wanted to do anymore. The next morning, I didn't say anything to Derek. I called Marcus. And the thing about that call, the thing that still makes me feel sick in a specific physical way, is that Marcus already knew. Not everything, but enough. That he had gotten a similar message, or some version of the truth had already reached him through a different path. And what he said to me, his wife, his cousin, was that people were trying to create conflict. That I should be careful about what I said to Deja, that things were complicated, that he didn't want this to blow up before the divorce proceedings were further along. He used the word divorce, like it was already a fact. I said, Marcus, did you know? He said, Renata, it's complicated. I said, that is not an answer. There was a silence on the phone that lasted long enough for me to understand everything I needed to understand about who was going to protect me in this situation. And the answer was no one. Not Marcus. Not the people who had been in my home week after week, and not the people who had sat at my table and eaten my food, and watched my children grow. I hung up the phone. And then Derek came downstairs in the way he always came downstairs. Relaxed, easy, the way of a man who slept soundly. And he poured himself coffee, and he asked if I was okay. And I looked at him, and I said yes, because I wasn't ready, because my kids were going to wake up in 20 minutes, and I needed to get them breakfast, and get them dressed, and get them to school, because I had learned, without knowing I was learning it, that my survival required me to be functional first. I made eggs, the same way he had that first night. I should have trusted my instincts. I made eggs, and I got my kids ready, and I drove them to school, and I drove past Deja's house on the way, and I looked at it, the windows, the driveway, I'd her SUV parked out front, and I thought about every time I'd walked through that front door, every time I'd sat in that kitchen, every conversation that was actually a collection. I confronted Derek that evening, after the kids were asleep. I want to tell you it was cinematic. I want to tell you I had a speech, something sharp and true that pinned him in place. But what actually happened is that I sat down at the kitchen table with my phone, and I showed him the text, and I said, "I need you to tell me the truth." He looked at the phone for a long time, long enough that I counted my own heartbeats. 11, 12. He said, "Who sent this?" I said, "That is not what I asked you." He said, "Someone is trying to start conflict, Renata." I said, "Are you telling me this is not true?" He said, "I'm telling you that whatever this is, it is not what you think." And then he stood up, and he walked out of the kitchen, and he went upstairs, and he did not sleep in the bedroom that night. And the next morning, he was calm and close and attentive in the way he was always calm and close and attentive when I had gotten too close to something real. It took months more, months of the slow unraveling, the documents, the lawyer, the things that eventually got officially confirmed. But that night in the kitchen was when I knew. And knowing, really knowing, was the loneliest place I've ever been. Before I tell you what happened next, if you want to hear the rest of this, like and subscribe. It only takes a second, and it means everything to me. Drop a comment with your location and your local time. I read every single one. And now let me take you back to those first weeks after that kitchen table conversation. The first thing I did was change the locks. Derek was still technically living in the house at that point. We were in that painful, suspended state of a marriage that both people know is over, but that hasn't been declared yet legally, and so changing the locks was not something I could do unilaterally without consequence. But I needed to do something with my hands, something that had a result, something that said, I exist. I have agency. I can alter the physical world around me, even when everything internal has been rearranged without my permission. So I went to the hardware store at 7 a.m. I remember because they'd just unlocked the front door, and the man in the orange apron looked slightly surprised to see me there with my coat half-buttoned. And I bought new deadbolts, and I came home, and I sat on the floor, and I watched 3 YouTube tutorials, and I changed the locks myself. It took 2.5 hours. One of the cylinders didn't line up correctly on the first try, and I had to take the whole thing apart and start over, and I sat on my entryway floor, and I cried. Not about the lock, about all of it, about the 19 years Deja had been in my family, and the fact that I was going to have to drive past her house every morning taking my kids to school, about my son Caleb, who was 13 by then, and who had lost his father when he was 4, and who had built something real with Derek, and who was going to lose that too. About the mortgage. About the destination wedding. The one we had planned for 18 months, and that cost a number I am not going to tell you without taking a breath. And the fact that it happened 2 months before things fell apart, which meant that every photo from that day had her in it, somewhere, because she was there, smiling, dancing, holding my flowers while I fixed my dress. She held my flowers. I got the lock installed by 9:30. I remember sitting back on my heels and trying the key 3 times, just to feel the bolt move. Deja texted me that afternoon. She said, "Hey, are you okay? I heard things are tense. I'm here if you need to talk." And I stared at that message for a long time. There is a specific kind of audacity that goes beyond lying. It's the kind that requires you to believe the other person is so far from the truth that they can be managed indefinitely, that they can be offered comfort by the same hands that caused the wound, and will accept it without understanding the source. I didn't respond. What I did instead was go through every text thread I had with her over the previous 2 years, and read them. All of them. The advice she'd given me about my marriage, the times I'd told her I was scared, the times I'd told her things about Derek that I'd never told anyone else because she was my safe person. And I read all of that, and I understood, for the first time completely, that there was a version of me in Derek's house, a map of me, and built from everything I'd confided in her, that he had access to any time he needed it. Every time I'd tried to get ahead, he already knew, because she had already told him. My kids lost Kira almost overnight. Imani asked about her every day for 3 weeks. She'd ask in the car on the way to school, "When are we going to see Kira?" And I'd say something vague and soft about things being different for a while, and she'd look out the window with an expression that a 7-year-old shouldn't have to carry. They didn't just lose their aunt and uncle. They lost their cousins. They lost the whole architecture of what family had meant. And then one night, this is the moment that I keep coming back to, the one that still sits still in me like a stone. I was putting Maya to bed. She was 4, and she had her stuffed rabbit and her specific blanket and the nightlight that made stars on the ceiling. And she said, "Mama, is Aunt Deja mad at us?" I held very still. I said, "No, baby. Nobody's mad at you. You didn't do anything wrong." She said, "Okay," and she closed her eyes. And I sat beside her bed in the dark, with the starlight moving on the ceiling, and I thought about everything it cost to say those 4 words, "You didn't do anything wrong," and mean them from the deepest place in me, while the rest of me was on fire. Rock bottom is not a single night. I want to be clear about that, because the mythology of rock bottom makes it sound like an event, a discrete, dateable moment where everything reaches its lowest point and then turns around. That is not what it was. It was a season. It was February through April, and when Derek officially left, when the divorce process began in earnest, when the financial picture came fully into focus and I understood, standing in the kitchen on the phone with my attorney at 10:30 on a Tuesday morning, exactly what had been done to me systematically, over time, with planning. The wedding had cost $34,000, a destination. His family and mine, and our friends, and the people we loved all gathered in one place to witness something that, it turned out, at least several of them already knew was a performance. The mortgage existed. The debt existed. The legal fees were accumulating. I owed him nearly $10,000 from the decree, money that bought me 1 year to refinance the house. I now could barely stand to be inside. And I didn't have a path to a new attorney, and I was working more hours than I had since before my children existed. I was fixing property damage he had caused and refused to address. Holes in walls, things that required contractors, things that cost money I didn't have. I was managing a parenting plan that he was treating as a rule book for restriction rather than a document built for our children. He was in contempt almost weekly. He introduced a new girlfriend 6 months after he left. He introduced her to our children before telling me. He said she knew everything, which he said while continuing to refuse to answer basic questions about what he had done and when. He called his personal life, as if that phrase was a wall that nothing could scale. I was awake at 3 a.m, more nights than I can count during those months. Not because I couldn't sleep, and because my body would pull me out of sleep at exactly that hour, every time, with an urgency that felt biological, like a system check, like some part of me was scanning the environment for threats, even in the dark. And in those 3 a.m. hours, I would lie very still and replay things. I would replay the conversation in the kitchen when I showed him the text. I would replay his voice saying, "It's not what you think." And I would try, again, to find the interpretation of those words that would make them true in a comforting way. I never found it. I would replay every conversation I'd had with Deja. I'd go through them like evidence, like someone building a case, looking for the moments I could have seen it, and I'd find them. There were so many of them, and I'd think about how clearly I can see them now, and how completely invisible they were then, and I'd understand, again, in my body, what coercive deception actually does to a person. It doesn't just fool them. It rearranges their ability to trust their own perception. It makes them a stranger to their own instincts. I had an instinct the first night he came home late, and his answer was too smooth. I asked him about dinner instead. One night. This was late March, I know, because the clocks had just changed, and it was that disorienting week when dark falls at a new time. I was cleaning out a cabinet in the bedroom, just organizing, just trying to do something useful with my hands. And I found, at the back of the highest shelf, a photograph. It was from one of our weekly double dates, me and Derek, Marcus and Deja, at a restaurant we used to go to, probably 18 months before anything came out. We're all smiling. The wine glasses are full. Deja has her hand on my shoulder. Derek has his arm around me. Marcus is laughing at something off camera. We look like a family. We look real. We look like people who loved each other. I sat on the bedroom floor, and I held that photograph, and I did not cry. I was past crying by that point. What I felt was something closer to awe. The terrible, awful awe of understanding how completely you can be deceived by people you trusted, inside a life that looked whole from the outside. I sat there for a very long time. The house was quiet. The kids were asleep. The furnace was making its sound. The photograph was real, and the people in it were strangers. I put it face down in the drawer, as I did not throw it away. I don't know why. Maybe because throwing it away would have required a certainty I didn't have yet. Maybe because some part of me still needed the proof that I hadn't imagined the warmth, that it existed, that it was taken from me, rather than never existing at all. If you have ever trusted someone so completely that their deception didn't just hurt you, It made you question your own memory of being alive inside that relationship. Tell me in the comments. How did you handle it? What did you do on the nights when the silence was too loud and the past felt closer than the present? I want to know. And if you are still here with me, hit that like button, because the next part is where everything begins to shift. I want to tell you that I hated him. Clean and simple and complete. Just pure, uncomplicated hatred, and the kind that would have made the whole thing easier to carry. And there were moments when I did. There were moments when he would send a message that was a variation of the gaslighting. Some version of this is your perception, not reality. And I would feel something rise in me that was hot and fast and had no patience for nuance. But the truth is messier than hatred. The truth is that I also missed him. I missed the person I believed he was. I missed the man who made eggs when I was upset. I missed the father he was to my kids on the mornings when he was just there, just present, just making lunches and being ordinary in a way that felt like abundance, when I was coming out of a time when ordinary was not guaranteed. I missed the weight of someone beside me in the bed, even knowing what I know now, and even knowing what happened in that bed. That is the thing no one tells you about loving someone who betrayed you. The love doesn't know about the betrayal. The love predates it. The love lives in your body, in a way that is not rational, not updated by new information, not capable of immediate revision, just because you've been handed the truth. Your body still remembers sleeping well. Your body still reaches for the familiar in the dark, even when the familiar is a wound. There were 3 specific nights where I almost texted him, not to reconcile, not to forgive, just to make the silence less loud, to confirm that the life I'd lived wasn't a complete fiction, that somewhere in it there was something real, that only 2 of us shared. I sat with my phone in my hand on those 3 nights, and I typed and deleted and typed and deleted, and each time I finally put the phone down, I felt a particular brand of lonely that doesn't have a clean name. The loneliness of still knowing someone in your body when you no longer know them in your mind. What stopped me, every time, was Caleb, my son, who was 13 by then, who had lost his biological father at 4 years old, who had built a real thing with Derek over the years, a relationship that had texture and history and the specific tenderness of a step-parent relationship done right, and who was now watching me from a careful distance, taking readings on how a person handles devastation. I knew that. I knew that my kids were watching me. I knew that they were learning from my body language and my choices and the things I said and didn't say. Everything they were going to carry about how women respond when they are wronged. And I could not give them the version where I texted him from loneliness at midnight. Not because I wasn't allowed to be lonely, but because I had made a decision, somewhere in those 3 a.m. hours, that I was going to be the thing that stays, the constant, the gravity, the one thing in their lives that doesn't move when everything else does. That decision did not feel triumphant. It felt like something I was putting on because nothing else was available. And Deja, I want to talk about Deja for a moment, because the rage there was a different animal entirely. The rage about Derek was comprehensible. Betrayal by a partner, however deep, however layered, has a grammar I could find. But the rage about Deja was formless. It was too large to think about directly. When I tried to think about her specifically, about her sitting in my living room and smiling at me, about her holding my daughter, about her saying things like "you know I love you" like a little sister. When I tried to think about that directly, something in me just closed, like a circuit breaker, like the mind protecting itself from a current it isn't rated for. There was one night where the rage came out sideways. I was folding laundry, just folding laundry, the most ordinary thing, and I found one of Imani's socks with a cartoon character on it that Deja had given her for her birthday. It was a pink sock with a yellow character, completely insignificant, and I stood there holding it for 30 seconds, and then I put it in the trash, and not because the sock was evil, because I needed to put something of hers somewhere it would stop being seen. The next morning, Imani asked about the sock. I said I couldn't find it. That lie, that small, pink sock lie, cost me something, because I had just told my daughter that something her aunt gave her was lost, when actually I'd thrown it away, because I didn't have a better way to process the feeling of holding an object that connected her to us. And that felt like Deja's fault too, that my grief was spilling onto my children in small, sock-shaped ways. The small conscious choice I finally made was this. I found a therapist. Not a couples therapist. Not a mediator. A therapist who was mine. Just mine. Who I saw every Thursday at 11 in the morning while the kids were at school. And the first thing I told her, the very first thing, was that I needed to stop performing okay and start actually working toward it. She said, "Those are two very different things." I said, "I know. That's why I'm here." It was an ordinary Tuesday. I know it was Tuesday because I just dropped the kids at school and stopped at the gas station on the corner, and I was putting my card back in my wallet when a woman, I didn't know her, pulled up to the pump next to me. She had a toddler in the back seat, and she was moving fast, the way mothers of toddlers always move, with that efficiency born from 1,000 small interruptions. She fumbled her keys. They hit the ground. I picked them up. She said thank you, looked at me directly for 1 second. I don't know what she saw, but she said, "You okay?" Strangers don't ask that. Not really. You say fine, you keep moving. That's the contract. But something in the way she asked it, without performance, without preamble, just "you okay?" Something about it landed. I said, "I'm getting there." And she nodded, the way someone nods when they know exactly what that sentence contains. She took her keys. She got back in her car. She drove away. I sat in my car for 10 minutes after that, not crying, not replaying, just sitting. And for the first time in months, maybe, I thought about the future in a way that wasn't threaded through with dread. I thought about Maya at 7. I thought about Imani at 12, her hair done by her own hands. I thought about Caleb at 18, the specific gravity of him, the quiet way he'd been watching me rebuild, the way I caught him once cleaning the kitchen without being asked, because he understood, and without my saying it, that I was tired. I thought, they are going to be okay. I am going to make sure of it. The tide doesn't turn in a thunderclap. It turns in 10 minutes in a gas station parking lot with a stranger you'll never see again. It turns when you say "I'm getting there" out loud, and your body, for the first time, doesn't immediately contradict you. I drove home, and I made a list. A different kind of list than the one I'd made in the kitchen the night of the text. Not a list of facts. A list of forward motion. Talk to a housing attorney separately about the property damage liability. Call the school counselor about Imani's withdrawal. research legal aid options for modification to the parenting plan, make an appointment with Caleb's therapist to do a joint session. Things I could actually do. Things that would move something, not even slightly, in a direction I wanted. I started at the top. 7 months after the divorce was finalized, Derek needed something. Not something small, something significant, specific, and something that, by the architecture of what we had built together, by the legal and practical reality of our shared parenthood, only I could provide. He needed documentation, specific financial records from a jointly held account from the years of our marriage, records that related to a property dispute he'd gotten into with a contractor, records that had to be produced within a legal window, or he'd face a default judgment that would have cost him considerably. He called. An actual phone call, not a message through the parenting app. The first call that wasn't about the children in over a year. I knew, before I answered, what he was going to ask, and not because I'm clairvoyant, because I knew the timeline. I knew the contractor dispute existed. His attorney had been in communication with mine peripherally, and I knew what documents would be required, and I knew I had copies, because I'd kept meticulous records during our marriage, out of the same organizational instinct that had served me in every other area of my life. He asked. He asked in the measured, careful voice of a man who understands exactly how exposed he is, who knows, in the bones of it, that the person he is asking has every reason to simply not respond. I said, "I'll need to look for them." He said, "I understand. Thank you I appreciate it." He didn't finish the sentence. That's the part that I keep thinking about. He started to say something and didn't finish it, and I think what he was trying to do was to acknowledge something, some debt, some weight, that he didn't have language for, because having language for it would have required admitting the shape of what he'd done. I found the documents that evening. It took me 45 minutes. I scanned them and sent them to his attorney with a cover letter that was so professionally worded, so precise, so completely devoid of anything personal, that his attorney, a woman named Cheryl, who I had never liked on principle, emailed me back to say it was the most organized disclosure she'd received on a matter like this. I did not send them to punish him. I did not withhold them to harm him. I sent them because my children share a father with this man, and a default judgment that destabilized his finances would have made him less able to support them, and I prioritized my children over my anger. But I also want to be honest that there was something in the act of doing the right thing with complete competence, something in having the records, because I was always organized, something in having kept everything because I was always prepared, something in being the person who showed up even when he hadn't. There was something in that sequence that felt, for the first time, like the world acknowledging that I had existed in this story too. Around the same time, something happened with Deja that I did not engineer and could not have predicted. There is a woman in our neighborhood, older, knows everyone, the kind of person who has lived in a community long enough to be a kind of institutional memory, and she had known Marcus and Deja for years. She came to me, or she came to my door one afternoon, which she had never done before, and she said that she wanted me to know that she had seen, and she had heard, and she had formed her own accounting of events, and that she wanted me to know, directly, that the people who mattered in this community knew what had happened, and they knew what kind of woman I had been in it. She said, "You kept your dignity, That's not nothing. That's everything. She was 73 years old. She had on a blue coat, and she was holding a covered dish, and she said those words with the quiet authority of someone who has lived long enough to know the difference between what burns bright and fast and what burns long and steady. I invited her in. We had coffee. She stayed an hour. And when she left, and I stood at my front door, and I thought about all the times I had imagined vindication as something loud, something public and declared, a moment where the truth was finally stated in a room full of the right people. But what it actually looked like was a 73-year-old woman in a blue coat at my front door on a Wednesday afternoon, telling me that she saw me. That was enough. That was, in some ways, more than enough. The financial reckoning came for them too, eventually. Not from me, not by anything I did, but from the weight of choices compounded over time. I won't detail it beyond saying that the kind of life built on a foundation of deception is expensive in ways that don't show up on the ledger immediately, but always show up eventually. What I will say is that by the end of that year, several of the people who had sat in my house at my table and had chosen to know and say nothing, several of them had their own reckonings, quiet and private, and not the dramatic justice I had imagined in my 3 a.m. hours. What I felt when I heard about it was not satisfaction. It was something quieter, closer to the feeling you get when a very long winter finally just ends. Not a dramatic thaw. Just the first morning when the temperature is different, and you don't have to brace yourself against the cold. 14 months after the divorce was finalized, I sold the house. Not at a loss, not at a spectacular profit, but for enough to clear the debt, enough to put a down payment on something smaller, something that had never held any of the things that had happened inside those walls. The day the sale closed, and I sat in my car outside the old house for a minute and looked at the front door. The door with the lock I changed myself at 7 a.m. with a heart like a broken machine, and I said goodbye to it without any particular ceremony. I drove to the new place. It was 12 minutes away. Different school zone. Something I'd negotiated because Imani needed it, because that kindergarten classroom with Kira's desk in it was something none of us could keep circling. Caleb helped me hang shelves the first weekend. He is 15 now. He is quiet in the specific way of teenage boys who are processing things they don't have full language for yet, and I tried to give him room for that, without letting him disappear into it. He picked the spot for the shelves, a wall in the living room, south-facing, and at good light, and he measured twice before he drilled anything. I watched him measure twice, and I thought about all the ways a child absorbs their parents' care without knowing they're absorbing it. Maya started calling the new place our house from the first night. She does not have the same relationship to loss that Caleb does, because she was too young to understand what was there before. For her, this is just home. I am grateful for that, and I try not to think too hard about what it means that I am grateful for my youngest child's unawareness. Imani is doing better. She still misses Kira in the low-grade way of a child who has learned that some losses are just losses, not fixable, not replaceable, just real. She does not ask about Deja by name anymore. She asks sometimes if people can stop being family, and I tell her the truth, which is that family is made of choices, and sometimes people make choices that change things, and that doesn't change what she is owed in terms of love and consistency. She thinks about that for a while when I say it. I can see her processing it. She is 7, going on something much older. As for the last real interaction I had with Derek, it was at a school event. One of those evenings where both parents are expected, and the hallways are full of children's artwork, and you stand next to each other, because there is nowhere else to go, and the context requires a version of civility that you deliver for your children, and for no other reason. He was there with his girlfriend. She stood slightly apart from him, the way people stand when they're not sure of their footing in a room. I didn't look at her long enough to form an impression. Me and Derek and I stood next to each other in front of a piece of Maya's artwork, a drawing of our family in the new house, all of us stick figures with enormous heads and very specific hair. And he said, very quietly, "She's got your eye for detail." I said, "She does." He looked at the drawing for another moment. He said, You look like you're doing well." It wasn't an apology. I didn't want an apology. Apologies from that particular source, at this particular remove, would have required me to do something with them that I wasn't interested in doing. What it was an acknowledgement. Small and careful, and arrived too late. The acknowledgement of a man who had looked at the evidence of who I was, in that organized document disclosure, in that new house, and in these 3 children with their enormous heads and specific hair, and understood, finally, what he had cost himself. I said, "I am doing well." And then Maya came running down the hallway and grabbed both of our hands at once, one in each, the way she does, the way she's always done, and pulled us toward her classroom because she wanted to show us her cubby, and I let myself be pulled, and that was the whole of it. Not forgiveness, not a reckoning, just a woman and a man in a school hallway, and a child between them pulling toward something new. If you liked how this ended, not with a fight, not with a breakdown, but with quiet dignity choosing itself over and over until it became the truest thing. Then subscribe and check the description. I have more stories just like this one waiting for you. Now let me tell you the last thing, and I've been thinking about what to say here, about what any of it meant. And I keep coming back to the thing I don't say enough, which is that the hardest part wasn't the betrayal. The hardest part was learning to trust my own perception again. Because here's what coercive deception does, that the betrayal alone doesn't do. Betrayal wounds you in a direction. It comes from outside of you, and it lands, and it hurts, and it has a source and a shape. But systematic deception, the kind where someone uses your trust and your love and your openness as instruments against you, where they coach your allies and feed you false information and make you feel guilty for the very instincts that were trying to protect you. That kind of deception doesn't just wound you, it relocates you. It puts you at a distance from yourself, as it makes the person you should trust most, yourself, feel like an unreliable narrator. I spent a year being uncertain of my own memory. I spent a year second-guessing my instincts, and I want to tell you, because this is what nobody says clearly enough in the recovery narrative, that rebuilding trust in your own perception is a longer project than rebuilding any of the practical things. The house, the finances, the legal situation, those have timelines. Those have steps. Those can be organized into a list and addressed in sequence. But learning to believe yourself again, learning to feel something cold in your chest and say that is information, not anxiety, that is different. That is patient and non-linear and deeply unglamorous work. Therapy helped. My Thursday morning therapist, who had a very calm way of reflecting my own words back to me in ways that made them audible. Journaling helped, not because it resolved anything, but because it made a record, and the record was external, and the external record could not be gaslit. And time helped, the way time always helps when you stop asking it to hurry. My kids helped. I know that sounds like I'm putting weight on them that they shouldn't carry, so let me be specific. They didn't help by needing me, though they did. They helped by existing in their own right, in the specific, non-negotiable fact of their personalities, their humor, their growth. Caleb measuring twice before he drills. Imani processing every hard question out loud because she is built for language. Mia calling this new place our house from the first night, to the way only someone without context for the past can claim a future. They are the evidence that something real happened, that something good lived in the middle of all that deception, that not everything that grew out of those years was a lie. I used to have a Sunday afternoon routine. Before any of this, before Derek, before the wedding, before the October barbecues and the group chats and the double dates and the discovery, I used to sit on the porch on Sunday evenings, just for 20 minutes. After the kids were fed and settled, and I'd drink tea and I wouldn't do anything else. Just sit, just be quiet, just be present in my own life. I lost that for a long time. The years of the marriage were too busy, and then the years of the unraveling were too loud, and then the years of the aftermath were too consuming, and the Sunday porch ritual just disappeared. I found it again this past spring. The new house has a small porch, west-facing, and the evenings are long now, and I sit out there on Sunday after the kids are settled, and I drink tea, and I don't do anything else. The neighborhood is different. The light falls at a different angle. But the feeling, the quiet, the presence, the plain fact of being alive in my own body, without performing it for anyone, that feeling came back. It came back not in spite of everything that happened, but carrying it, changed by it, made larger by the fact of having lost it and found it again. I want to say something to you if you are in the middle of something like this right now, not at the other end, in the middle, at where you can't see the exit, and the nights are too loud, and the loss is too layered, and your children are watching you hold something you weren't built to hold alone. I want to say, your instincts are not broken. I want to say, the cold feeling in your chest is information. I want to say, keeping your dignity in the face of everything that was done to you is not weakness. It is not compliance. It is not being naive or passive or afraid. It is a very specific, very intentional, very exhausting form of power. The power of choosing who you are when everything around you is trying to tell you who you should become. I don't know your story, but I know the feeling of sitting in a kitchen at 2:14 in the morning, holding a truth that rearranges everything. And I know, from the other side of it, and from the Sunday porch, and the new locks, and the child who calls this home without remembering anywhere else, I know that the rearrangement is not the end. It is a different kind of beginning. You don't have to have everything figured out to keep going. You just have to keep going,